The Progress Center provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators in developing and implementing high-quality education programs that enable children with disabilities to make progress and meet challenging goals. Again, we encourage you to visit us at www.promotingprogress.org to learn more. As I mentioned, my name is Shidi Ajasamali. I'll be moderating today's forum as well as the Q&A at the end of each session. I'd also like to welcome Dr. David Emenheiser, who is the Progress Center's Project Officer at the Office of Special Education Programs, and Pamela Allen, who is the Education Program Specialist at the Office of Non-Public Education, both at the U.S. Department of Education. They both have been great collaborators and partners in planning this forum. I'm also excited to introduce Dr. Christerralyn Brown, who is the keynote for our forum. She is the Intensive Technical Assistance Co-Lead at the Progress Center and a Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Center on Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports, both at the American Institutes for Research. Before we begin, I would like to give a few minutes to both David and Pamela to say a few words. David?
Thank you, Shidi. And welcome and greetings to you whenever you are joining us. As Shidi said, this is a recorded and it will be archived. So I do hope that you share this with all of your colleagues and come back and watch it again to get more information that you might have missed the first time through. I want to start by just saying thank you. These are really difficult times in schools, facing a lot of challenges. And I know that your perseverance, your excellence is what's making a difference to students and their families in their education. So thank you for doing that and for continuing with that. The great thing of what we're doing today is the Department of Ed does fund some resources, some tools to be able to help you do that work. And these, because they're funded through federal dollars, through taxpayer dollars, that means that they're free to anybody who wants to use them. The office that I work in, as Shidi said, is the Office of Special Education Programs, and it's our job to help build the capacity to serve children with disabilities and their families. And, you know, we at the federal level need to talk about it in terms of children with disabilities because that's what the law says. But we know that your schools think about these students in many different ways and not necessarily as a student with a disability. And when I was going through my teacher training, I heard a really great quote that has stuck with me all these years, and that is, good teaching is good teaching. So whether you're talking about a child with a disability, or you're talking about a child with gifted and talented, or you're talking about any other kind of child, it is a good teaching strategies are what make that child blossom and bloom. These resources that you're going to hear today are not about identification or about funding or things like that. We have developed a resource, questions and answers that cover some of those issues. I'm going to drop that link into the chat. So if you want to learn more about those topics, that's the place where you can go and get those answers. And then if you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Pamela if you do have further clarifications on those issues. But today we're going to be talking about the capacity. We're going to be talking about serving different kinds of students in ways that they really can thrive. And so we look forward to hearing from you. There will be more opportunities. This is going to be just the maybe the beginning of what we call the discussion on what we call the multiple tiered systems of support. And There will be an open door that is coming up in November, and Shidi will talk a little bit more about that, where you can have maybe more of an opportunity for a dialogue about these issues and how to implement them. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela to offer her welcome.
Thank you so much, David. And good morning. You know, as Shidi and David have said, we're so glad that you made it a priority to join us for this forum for the private school community today. And my name is Pamela Allen, and I am with the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Non-Public Education, or ONPE, as we often call it. And ONPE was established by Congress in 1978 with the mission of fostering the maximum participation of private school students and teachers in federal education programs and initiatives. And since the initial passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, in 1965, private school students and teachers have been eligible to participate in certain federal education programs. And the programs for private school students are often typically referred to as equitable services programs. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, contains such provisions. So knowing that even though today's session isn't going to be talking about the equitable services provisions, we wanted to know where you can find details about that. So I'll drop a link to our website in the chat in just a few minutes, and that way you can visit our site after today's forum to explore more. You know, at the U.S. Department of Education, we are very mindful of the independence and autonomy of private schools in our country. And we're also mindful that you serve students of all ability levels. So with this in mind, we hope that today's forum will help you find enhanced ways of supporting the diverse learners in your schools and help them gain greater access to the curriculum so that you can, those students can grow and learn and realize their full potential. And don't forget what David just mentioned about the upcoming open door gathering for the private school community on November 15th. We hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so grateful that you're here, and it really is our pleasure to serve you. So Shidi, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. So we have a little bit of recognition. So on September 19th, U.S. Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona recognized 297 schools, both public and non-public, as National Blue Ribbon Schools for 2022. Next slide, please. The recognition is based on a school's overall academic performance or progress in closing achievement gaps among student subgroups. Secretary Cardona made the announcement during his Road to Success Back to School bus tour. We would like to congratulate the 24 non-public schools who were recognized with this great achievement. Okay, so our next slide, please. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Christerralyn Brown. She is a technical assistance co-lead for the Progress Center and is also on the MTSS technical assistance team, where she works with a number of sites. Dr. Brown supports states, educational prep programs, school districts to build their capacity to implement evidence-based practices within MTSS. Her professional interests are in the area of intensive interventions for behavior, multi-tiered systems of supports, evidence-based practices, professional development, and culturally responsive classroom behavior strategies. She has a doctorate from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a master's degree in special education from the Governors State University. She is also a former elementary, middle, and high school special education teacher. Dr. Brown enjoys advocating for students as well as helping educators build knowledge and culturally responsive best practices to meet the needs of all students. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you very much, Shidi, for that amazing introduction. I am very happy to be here with all of you to discuss leveraging tiered systems of supports to meet the diverse needs of all students. So as we begin, can we just take a moment to drop in the chat, how do we ensure that all students are on the path to progress? Just share in the chat a few ways that you are ensuring that all students are on the path to progress. Looking for growth? Thank you for sharing that. Are there other ways? What are some other ways that we are ensuring that students are on the path for progress? Benchmark assessments throughout the year? Yes. Well, thank you for sharing those answers. Mia, you can go to the next slide, please. So remember, there is no way a single teacher has all the time and all the knowledge and all the skills to meet all the needs of every child in his or her classroom. We must use a collective approach. Next slide, please. We need a sustainable ecosystem with the capacity to develop and implement high-quality educational programming for all students, including students with disabilities. So how do we do this? How do we build a sustainable ecosystem for all? We need collective efficacy. And what exactly is collective efficacy? We define collective efficacy, teacher efficacy, as the collective belief of educators in their ability to positively affect students. Collective efficacy is more than just beliefs. It is built on evidence of impact. You have collective beliefs that you can make a difference, times the evidence you are making a difference, and then we have an estimated effect value of 1.57. So that means that the growth for collective student growth is impacted by collective efficacy. So collective beliefs that you can make a difference and evidence that you are making a difference. So you have to have some evidence there. It's not just the beliefs, but what's the evidence that are tied to those beliefs. So let's take a moment to discuss MTSS, our multi-tiered systems of support. MTSS provides the data and the infrastructure necessary to develop collective efficacy. And in our current graphic, there are essential components here that build those infrastructures. So you have the screening. We start with the screening process, as well as progress monitoring. Then we have database decision-making, which builds our multi-level prevention system. So it's about the prevention, not just intervening, but also prevention. MTSS also provides the data necessary for decision-making. And there are many levels and layers that are included in this collaborative system. You have organizational system. How do we improve school supports to improve outcomes? You have the school system. How do we improve teacher supports to improve outcomes? As well as the educator level. How do we improve student level supports to improve outcomes? And Dr. Tessie Bailey is dropping in the chat the link to the MTSS Center where you can view some of the additional resources. So remember, there's an organizational system, a school system, and an educator level systems, and we're all leading to increasing student outcomes. MTSS also promotes positive student and school outcomes. Improved performance outcomes looks at a decrease in expulsion, behavior referrals, as well as suspension rates, sustaining academic improvements, and increasing on-time graduation rates. There's also strong positive effects on system outcomes. Those effects include increased instructional and planning time, more efficient use of resources and staff, decreasing inappropriate special education referrals and placement rates, a reduction in student time in special education services, and a reduction in student grade retention. So again, MTSS promotes positive student outcomes for all. So what is MTSS? Well, it's a multi-tier system of supports. It's a proactive and preventive framework. It integrates data and instruction to maximize student achievement and supports. The MTSS framework is comprised of 4 essential components: the screening, the progress monitoring, the multi-level prevention system, as well as database decision-making. Our MTSS framework is driven by data, as well as all of our instruction practices. They're very database driven. Now take a moment and review the image. What do you see? What stands out to you? If you're able to, please share in the chat which of the elements is a critical element in your MTSS framework.
So Chrissy, it does appear that the chat is not enabled, but if you do look in the Q&A, you'll be able to see other folks' responses. So feel free to input your comments into the Q&A for Chrissy to see.
Thank you, Tessie. So in the chat, please, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, please share of the 4 essential components for our MTSS framework. Screening, thank you for sharing that, Mindy. Screening is an essential component. Interventions. Data is at the center, progress monitoring, use of data, database decision. So a lot around the use of data and database decision making. Thank you for sharing those. Next slide, please. So again, MTSS provides a continuum of supports. We have Tier 1, our universal level of prevention, our Tier 2, our targeted level of prevention, and then Tier 3, our most intensive level of prevention. Students with disabilities, gifted and talented, and English learners needs, they receive services at all levels depending on the need. So you can have a student who is considered an English learner receive Tier 3 supports as well as Tier 1 supports. That can also be the same for students with disabilities. They could receive Tier 3 supports in one subject and maybe Tier 1 supports in another subject. There's a continuum of supports. Again, there is no need to label students by needs. MTSS addresses the needs of the whole child by aligning systems and supports. So we don't say a Tier 2 child, but we say a child who's receiving Tier 2 supports. And they can receive supports in reading, math, engagement, written expression, attendance, emotional skills, communication skills. The supports go across subjects and content areas. So let's look at some data. MTSS at the local level. There's a national finding from a study that says only 28% of educators say that they are far along in implementing a tiered support framework. Most schools and districts are just at the beginning of their MTSS implementation journey with room to grow. Let's look at implementation at the local level. So where are interventions focused? Well, 74% of schools are reporting a focus at the literacy ELA level, 65% at the behavior level, math, 58%, social emotional learning, 41%, attendance, 32%, and 1% for other. Schools using PBIS, there has been an increase in the number of schools using PBIS over time to address the needs of students with behavior concerns. So the success of MTSS boils down to one simple equation. The design, so again, back to our framework, our screening, database decision-making, progress monitoring, and multi-level prevention systems, times the infrastructure, a look at leadership, effective teaming, professional learning, family and community engagement, and last but certainly not least, times the implementation. What does it look like to actually implement these essential components? Multi-tier system supports, or MTSS, is a preventive framework. We'll talk more about each of the components in the upcoming slides.
Christy, we got a question on what is PBIS. Can you share what that is?
Yes, and so PBIS, the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, and actually later today in this presentation, we will have a panel discussion about PBIS and the supports and resources that they have. Tessie, did you want to say?
Nope, you're good.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we will have an upcoming presentation following the panel about PBIS and those supports and resources, but it is the Positive Behavior Intervention Supports organization. So let's dive into lessons learned from 20 years of implementation, starting with implementation and outcomes in mind. So you have to start the design with the right questions in mind. What do we want for our children, educators, and schools? What is our current reality and who are the players? What do our children, educators, and schools need to be successful? And how can we maximize our resources to support students, teachers, and schools? Let's just take a minute and reflect on the questions in front of us. In the Q&A, can you share any additional questions that you think of when you're thinking about designing with the right questions in mind? Are there any other essential questions that you would add to our current list of questions? And I'll review the Q&A and share out. And Dr. Bailey has shared a PBIS link in the chat for your review to learn more about PBIS. It's important to identify who the we and our is, parents, staff, community. Thank you for sharing that. So identifying, I guess, as well as defining. Staff capacity to implement with fidelity versus use old existing strategies. How do we get all stakeholders involved? These are great essential questions and statements. Are there any other essential questions with designing with the right questions in mind? Well, thank you for sharing those. Mia, can we move to the next slide? So when selecting evidence-based practices and tools, consider effectiveness as well as efficiency. What's ideal versus realistic? So we always have, in our ideal world, we would have all of these resources and all of this time with all of this capacity. But we have to design with the realistic, what's our current framework? What are our current needs and our current capacity? So focus on practices that are fair. I love this acronym. I just learned this acronym this year from the amazing Dr. Tessie Bailey. But we start with we look at FAIR, the feasibility, the cost, specialized training, or complexity are feasible within our current context. Acceptability. Is it acceptable for impacted stakeholders, including teachers, leaders, and families? The impact. Is there evidence that it produced positive results on desired outcomes? The strength of the effects and the amount of evidence. Relevance. What is the research demonstrates impacts in similar settings and with children with similar characteristics? Age, grade, consider cultural, the needs, the socioeconomic status of our students. So again, this is a great acronym to think about when you're thinking about the focus on practices: the feasibility, the acceptability, the impact, and the relevance. And Dr. Tessie Bailey just dropped a link in the chat that is a resource connected to the FAIR acronym we just discussed. Remember, there is no single evidence-based practice that works for every student in every situation. We have to think about the context, the capacity, and the need of all of our staff as well as our students. Again, assessment must drive instruction. Starting with the appropriate screening and benchmarking, it helps us identify students who may need additional support and intervention. Progress monitoring, it helps identify when an instructional change is needed. Our diagnostic data, that deeper dive, it helps identify how to adapt and or modify instruction. And fidelity, it helps identify if implementation adjustments are needed before other changes. We have to start with the fidelity. Was the intervention implemented with fidelity initially before we decide to make any changes or adapt? We must maintain a focus on student outcomes, the why. Why are we implementing MTSS? Not just the process, the how, but the why. Starting back and remembering the why helps us regain focus and adjust accordingly. We can have a beautiful process and it can be very well written, but if we don't think about the outcome and the why, sometimes we lose sight when we think, oh, it's not working. Again, remember the why. Effective MTSS implementation depends on quality Tier 1 core programming. When you have quality Tier 1 programming and increased collective efficacy at Tier 1 leads to a decreased need for Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. Again, we have to start with our foundation. Making sure that you have a strong foundation ensures that we're trying to reach all students. And if we have less students at Tier 2 and Tier 3 needing Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, then we are having a greater impact on all students. Fidelity matters. The impact of MTSS depends on the extent to which educators implement the well-designed system in a sustainable ecosystem. Let's look at this graphic here. It's starting with, is there evidence that the intervention was delivered as intended? Adherence, how well do we stick to the plan, the curriculum, or assessment? Are the interventions and assessment delivered consistently across different teachers and settings? Exposure duration, does the schedule allow the intervention to be delivered for the recommended dosage? How often does the student receive an intervention? How long does it last? Is the teacher regularly available to support instruction? The quality of delivery. Does the interventionist have the necessary training, the knowledge and skills to deliver the intervention correctly? Are quality teaching practices used consistently and with appropriate intensity across all sessions? Program specificity. How well is the intervention defined and different from other interventions? And student engagement. How attentive and involved are the students in this intervention or activity? And I believe Dr. Bailey dropped the link to this graphic. You can find it at intensiveintervention.org, the 5 elements fidelity. Remember, plan big, but start small. Sometimes we want to jump all in and target academic and behavior and SEL all at once, but sometimes we need to, while you have a big plan, start small. What does your action plan look like? What are your year 1 goals? How are you piloting and maybe scaling up and then sustaining your framework? We have additional resources here at the Center on Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports at the American Institute for Research. I believe the link was dropped in the chat. You can drop down for each tab. There's essential components. We discussed the essential components of an MTSS framework, the implementation, there's resources. There's also the ability to request support. We have special topics as well as our expertise. And then there's also a library of supports that you can search. Dr. Bailey, did you want to say anything about the Center on Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports?
No, I just want to let you all know I put some links in the chat box, and there was a request for a copy of the links, and we will add those to the recording website, so you can link to all of those. But I'll put the main website for the center in the chat box again for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm going to hand it back over to Sheedy. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but thank you for joining us today to just get a brief overview. I'll just say an overview of some of the resources and supports that are out there.
Thank you, Chrissy, so much. This was a great presentation. It looks like we have a few minutes for a couple of questions. Is it okay? They've kind of come through, and I just wanted to address those if that's okay with you.
Yes.
The first one is, what are the ways schools can promote collective teacher efficacy?
So we have a lot of resources on teaming. I think starting with a very team-based approach, making sure that everyone understands the same language when discussing efficacy and identifying needs for students and thinking about supports. But I think starting with teaming, making sure that we're all using the same language. Dr. Bailey just dropped some teaming tools resources as well in the chat, but that's what I would say. Start with teaming, getting a universal foundation of language and systems in place.
Thank you, Chrissy. And then our final question, how do I know the data that I'm collecting is the right data?
Oh, that is a very good question. I would say looking at student growth and student outcomes. Like, what's the impact of that data on instruction and student growth and student outcomes? How is the student progressing within instruction as well as on assessments? So not just assessments, because we know all students may not perform well on assessments, whether or not they know the content or not, but what about just good instruction? How are they progressing within the classroom with your instruction?
Thank you, Chrissy. This was super helpful. I really appreciate your time, and we're excited to have you today.
Thank you.